Okay, George, thanks for talking to us. And my first question is, what is research-based theater? How is it different from all the other related labels like ethnodrama, ethnotheater, documentary theater, etc.?
Well, I would say it's more similar to the other areas than different. So all the other terms, I think there's a commonality in all of the terms that we use to define this work. The reason I can say why I have chosen to use research-based theater along with a number of other people here at the University of British Columbia is that we are most often working with a set of data, of formalized, systemized, collected data that we then translate, transform, bring to life through theater. So it's usually a research-funded project that a team of researchers has collected data that would be done in more traditional fashions, such as interviews, surveys, focus groups, and then we are gifted with that data with a team of artists, and then we try to bring it to life through theater. So fundamentally, research-based theater, when I think done in the way that we are trying to keep defining it, and again, it has flexibility, but it's a matter of honoring the research and then honoring the art form. Some of the other terms in the spectrum of applied theater and ethnodrama have other tendencies. So ethnodrama is typically, how I understand it, looking at ethnographic types of studies, whereas research-based theater might look at ethnographic studies, but it's also going to look at other forms or other methodologies. So that's probably where we've come to land with that term.
And what's the relationship between research-based theater to documentary theater?
I think, so again, there's a spectrum, and I think documentary theater in some ways is trying to capture the potentially verbatim, sometimes what has been said. And again, research-based theater, sometimes we are capturing verbatim text in it. I would say more often, though, we are trying to capture the essence of what took place. Often because we will have a whole set of data that might be one-on-one interviews. So how do you bring those particular one voices into a collective? So we start creating composite characters quite often who make a theatrical character a little bit more complex, but it also releases, if whoever's performing the piece was a research participant, it allows a little bit more distance because it's not just their story. So I think in some ways, if documentary theater is really going into a particular site and is actually really trying to cull faithfully, truthfully to what was there, documents it, whereas I think research-based theater, we give ourselves license to capture the essence or the fluidity of what might be happening, and then certainly giving it back to the participant members and saying, are we getting it right here? Are we, and sometimes I would say in a number of projects that once the research participants see it, they'll often say, that's what I was trying to articulate, actually, and their own words sometimes get in the way of trying to say what they wanted to. Therefore, the artist, which is the role of the artist, the writer, the director, the actor, is to sometimes speak something that an individual was thinking but wasn't quite able to put it to paper or to put it to the stage.
Would you give me some concrete examples that you think, well, it is a typical example of research-based theater?
Okay. Sure. So let me maybe speak to the Veterans Theater Project as one of the projects that would be falling underneath the umbrella of research-based theater. So in that case, there was a series of data. Some of it was data that both on veterans' experiences of transitioning home after serving in the military. Most often as Canadians, they would serve overseas in Iraq or Afghanistan. So we had a fair amount of data from counselors who had worked with veterans in a therapeutic way. So that data was either through literature or through previous written, analyzed documents. And also, there was already written narratives of veterans' experiences of coming home after service. So we used some of that data to inform a devising process. And then we brought in the veterans into the playing space. And not unlike the situation here, we were also interviewing the veterans as they would speak about their experience. And then we were able to capture some of that data in the play creation process. So there was data that was already in existence, and then there was data that we were co-collecting during the creation process with the veterans in place during the creation of the theater piece. And I'll give one specific example of an earlier version of the play. For instance, at one point we wanted to weave in some Shakespeare. We wanted to bring in Henry V's speech on St. Crispin's Day, where he's rallying his troops and they're ready to fight the French and they're completely outnumbered. But he's saying, you know, if you fight with me, you will not only you'll come home with great courage and great pride, etc. So we thought, let's see what do the veterans think about that speech, our current contemporary veterans. So it was a way for us to. So I had an actor do Henry V. And then the veterans would stop the actor at any point and say, "We wouldn't do that," or "This is our impression of this." So we were collecting data in some ways right in the moment. So the lead writer at that point, Graham Lee, was recording what veterans were saying, and gradually trying to put pieces of it into the script.
Okay, so that is the play Unload that I'm going to see this afternoon.
Correct.
Okay.
So the original version was called Contact Unload, and it had up to 6 to 7 veterans in it, and very more testimonial almost at times, and maybe documentary more at times, because the veterans would kind of come forward and tell a little bit about their stories. The Shakespeare was always woven into it, and there was a bit of a journey, but there was a lot of veterans' voices. The adaptation of Unload keeps some of the essence of that, but now brings in more the civilian voice. As you will see this afternoon, the piece is trying. I think we responded to what the audience was saying in terms of it was difficult for them to see themselves in the piece. They would empathize with the veterans, and I think we're quite opened to what a veteran might go through. I think where the adaptation goes, it takes the audience can. The play is much more porous. The proxy of the actor character allows them to see what their experience might be of loss, of trauma for the everyday person, not only a military veteran.
So in that production, the veterans are also the performers.
In which production?
In Unload.
Unload, yeah. So there is one veteran. It's mainly a two-hander Unload. It's one actor and one veteran, and it is indeed an authentic veteran who served, in this case, 10 years in the British Army as a Royal Commando.
So do we imagine that one day that the role of the veteran will be played by an actor, but not the veteran himself or herself?
Mm-hmm. I think in research-based theater, we ask that question to ourselves quite often. What is the value of actually having the participant there? Is there more of an authenticity for an audience? Because are we triggering the veteran in this case by continually telling their story? Some of the pieces in our collaborative of research-based theater, we do have actors playing the roles of participants. So we have a piece about water in small rural communities, and in this case, there's an actor playing the researcher, and there's an actor playing the water operator who is Indigenous, Canadian Indigenous. And we've created a device that it is actors playing those parts because we thought it's too big of an ask to ask a water operator who's an engineer to actually play a theater role. So in that case, we are going in that direction. I think with the research-based theater is really as much about catalyzing a discussion after someone sees the work. So it's a little bit of providing context on the research that we've done, and instead of presenting it in a paper, a chapter, or a presentation, it's doing a theatrical piece in order to then motivate, stimulate a discussion afterwards. So afterwards, if you have actually a veteran, in this case, in the production, there's a different conversation that happens with the audience than if it was an actor playing a veteran who is just trained to play whatever character comes his or her way. So I think with the veterans piece, Unload, as long as we can, we will keep a veteran in it. And I have to say that it becomes a reciprocal, continual learning of whoever the actor is playing with the veteran, is that the veteran keeps informing an authenticity to the theater piece or a truthfulness, and of course the actor provides theatrical literacy and theatrical techniques to the veteran. So there's this kind of beautiful dance that can happen, and certainly that is the case with Unload. And in our case, I think Luke, who plays the veteran, is, one will say that some people have an affinity to theater. He's very comfortable in his body. He's very comfortable in his speaking. So he has a presence that allows, I think, a balance in the theater piece. That it is a participant, a non-theater trained, but maybe it still works on stage.
So it seems to me that the participant or the researcher will also be the performer. It seems like one of the requirement or one of the ideal situation in research-based theater, right?
Yeah, I think in an ideal world, we'd love to have some of the researchers performing, some of the participants mixed in with the artists, so that there's a constant co-creation. And I think there's something very humbling for the researchers to be on stage as well, because then they start to understand the research that they're going to go out potentially to write about in a different way, because they aesthetically, they embody some of the interviews, and they start going, oh, okay, this is maybe something I hadn't thought about when I was reading the transcripts as a researcher. And because we're not aiming for an audience to sell tickets, we don't have that motivation that the show has to sell. It's really, how can we potentially empower people? How can we get more conversations? How might we affect change in some ways, greater understanding?
But there will be tension sometimes, as one of the presentations I've seen here about the residential school bills, and I can spot some tension between the researcher and the theater people, and so can you tell me a little bit more about that case?
Yeah, and I think, that's the beauty of theater. Theater's about tension. If there's no tension, there's usually no drama. It's a matter of how do we handle the tension, and then how willing are the people holding that tension willing to dance or to actually respect each other's perspectives. I think the example that you're giving, which with the residential schools project, which is has a long history of researchers who have really done some important work in collecting stories, collecting interviews, so that they're holding dearly to those interviews, and they don't want necessarily artists to do something that's going to be kind of artsy without the support anchoring it into the research. So there is a hesitancy to potentially use some of the theater devices too early. So with that one, I think it's still in early stages, and I think the responsibility of the researcher right now is weighing quite heavily on telling the story in a more predictable text central way. And that's not unusual. With the Veterans Project, it started that way as well. We had really resistance to kind of play and use different theatrical devices, using metaphors, using dialogue with characters, relationships. But eventually we got there because I think the veterans themselves realized that we need a narrative arc. We want a narrative arc. And we want the tools of the theater. So it took a journey, it took a while to get there. The Veterans piece has been done now 30 plus times, and we've done different tours, so we've had time in between to kind of revisit the piece, bring in new people, bring in new artists, and so we'll see with the residential schools one if there's an appetite to bring in more of the theater elements.
Because I forget the name of the person who's in charge. Is it
Grant Charles.
Grant. And it seems that he during the discussion on the last section, he kept saying that, well, we want to get the message across. We want to get the message across. We don't want the theater people to interfere with that. So,
Sure.
So how will you convince people like this, or researcher like this, who think, don't mess with my message?
Sure.
So,
well, I think my job sometimes is not to convince, is to offer opportunities and trying to show that when we use metaphor, which is what we do in the theater, we open up the audience to see for themselves as opposed to telling them. We're showing, we're making something porous so that the audience is deeply affected, moved by it, but also transformed to somewhere else. Whereas sometimes I think if it's more of a reader's theater or a text that's a series of interviews, we get deeply informed and we can be moved by it, though it's a different experience than in a theater experience where we are able to see other narratives and potentially enter into the discussion. It becomes more of a dialogue between the characters and the audience, but sometimes when it's more straight front, direct, it's more of a monologue that's given to us, and then there's little place for us to breathe and to enter.
And also, how can you, because at what I'm doing in Hong Kong, sometimes people will ask me, how can you guarantee that you are getting the essence? You are really getting the essence. You are because documentary theater is quite new in Hong Kong. People will compare it to documentary film. They think that, well, documentary film, I understand it's real because of the person I see on screens are real people and the original interviewees. But I use actors to play the interviewee. How can you guarantee that it's real? And how can you guarantee that it's objective? And also, how can you guarantee that you are not distorting the words of the interviewees? So, what is the tools you use to?
Yeah, and of course, it's not possible to. We never can get it fully right because it constantly changes. Even what someone might tell you in an interview is that they might change their mind the next day. Certainly, if you interviewed me in 2 weeks from now about research-based theater, I might have a different perspective on it. I think I should also mention that Canada, as in our theater history, during the 70s, we had a lot of documentary theater, and a lot of theater burgeoning companies were doing a lot of these documentary theaters. And a colleague at the University of Guelph, Alan Falwad, has written beautifully about documentary theater in Canada, and a lot of it was for political reasons that they would bring these documentary plays. And so it's a beautiful period in Canadian theatre history that was marked by that, where actors sometimes would go to a particular community, interview individuals, kind of the very, very precursors of the Laramie Project, and a bit more rough than the Laramie Project. But some beautiful plays. One, the name is escaping me right now, but The Farm Show, for instance, is a 1970s show by Theatre Passe Muraille, and Paul Thompson was the playwright, but really it's a collective. So a lot of that work was done in a collective. So bringing it back to research-based theater, I think we borrow from we definitely borrow from the documentary form in the sense we often work in a collective type fashion. I think the best we can do to check if we're kind of getting it right, a few ways, I guess, is by performing, sharing the piece with the participants again to get their feedback, have them constantly involved in our process. I'm learning a great deal about assessment and evaluation because our collaborative here at UBC has some wonderful experts in that area. And I think sometimes you learn through the surveys that you're doing, the focus groups, the interviews, you start realizing, hey, what is it that the audience is getting out of this? And if we're responsive to it, in our case, we can then do more iterations of the particular play. So therefore, we get a little bit closer to, I think, representing what we thought we were trying to represent.
Okay, so that more or less the last question is, UBC, I think, or your department in UBC is putting a lot of effort in developing this research-based theater. Can you tell me a bit about what you are exactly doing here about this particular genre?
So it's less department-based, it's really kind of university-based. What we're calling the research-based theater collaborative is really across the campus. We have people in engineering, we have people in geography, social work, occupational therapy, law, School of Population Health, music, theater. So we have people from across the university who all themselves, some are stakeholders because they have rich data and they want to find a way to kind of breathe life into it, bring it to life. And most of them it's because they've seen an earlier version of some of the work that we've done and they kind of go, I want something like this. And then we have to help them navigate to get there. These are some of the steps that we have to take. So the university has been very supportive of it. So I belong to what's called the Program for Research Excellence, which funds projects that are catalyzing and mobilizing research. So the university has been funding me for the last 3 years to try to bring these people together and then to bring different experts in Canada or around the world to come and meet with us and kind of enter into the mix. So like yourself, your influence on being here and the conversations that you've had with others will continue to help us grow. So that's probably how it's growing as a cluster at the university. And I'm also part of what's called the Peter Wall Institute of Advanced Studies, and that's a very interdisciplinary group of people. And through that institute, which is on campus, and I've met a lot of researchers in different areas, and I've been given the opportunity to share some of the work that I've done, but also all the work that others are doing. And there's been a lot of conversations to see how can theater be used in collaboration with other researchers. So I think UBC has been a very generous space for that. But I think anyone can do that at their own institution but it's a long process. A lot of it is a courting period. So the one on occupational therapy, for instance, Tal and I had been meeting for the course of a year before we really started developing it. Grant with the residential schools as well, probably the course of a year or two, and seeking funding in different ways to make it happen. And the veterans piece as well, it took some time, the water one, and now we've got about 5 or 6 that we're going to continue developing, and some of them are at the conversational stage. But it's exciting, and a lot of our grad students, our master's and our PhD students are working on these projects. They're writing their theses on these projects, so they enable us to kind of give the literature, the theory, at the same time as the practice. So we're in a space, I think, where there's support for it financially, but I think there's a support for it because people believe in it. They see it and they go, wow, okay, I'm not only in my head, I'm in my body and in my heart, because I see the work, and I think the researchers are getting excited. They want to share their research in a way that's a little bit more public.
Yeah. Thank you very much, John.
Yeah.
I think that's all for
You're
today.
welcome.
And